By Final Fantasy III's release in 1990, the series has been given a strong track record for Hironobu Sakaguchi and the developer Square. In the wake after Final Fantasy III's release, the coming of age for the Super Famicom was months away, and the time for the JRPG franchise to transfer from the 8-bit to 16-bit generation was inevitable. However, most of the original team behind the first 3 games pretty much disbanded themselves toward other projects and/or other paths in their careers, but Hironobu Sakaguchi, Nobuo Uematsu, and Yoshitaka Amano continued to remain with the series as they sought to continue it with newer developers and younger blood. The next Final Fantasy began development after Square received development kits based on the Super Famicom, and Sakaguchi decided that the next game should become known as the ultimate Final Fantasy game that blends in with all the good aspects from the Famicom titles. Those aspects were story development that took priority in Final Fantasy II, and the job system that took effect in Final Fantasy I and III. By blending in these aspects would be what the next game would channel itself as. Development for 2 new Final Fantasy games were initially in development, with one for the Famicom that would be the 4th game, and one for the Super Famicom that would be the 5th game. However, due to financial and scheduling constraints, Square opted out of the idea for another Famicom entry, and thus the 4th game would be on the Super Famicom instead. A mock-up screenshot of the game was showcased in Japanese magazines, but no more information was given toward the Famicom title. According to Sakaguchi, he stated that the cancelled Famicom entry was roughly 80% complete before cancellation, and certain ideas were reused in the Super Famicom entry. This would also be the first work for the new-coming full-time employee named Takashi Tokita, and he originally had the desire to become a theater actor, but opted out as his desire to create video games captured his interest more. Hiromichi Tanaka, the man responsible for Final Fantasy III's game design, was initially involved with the work on Final Fantasy IV, but he became uncertain with the direction of reusing the same battle mechanics. He opted in wanting to have a real-time battle system instead of taking the same approach as before, but the idea didn't break through, as the formula remained unchanged with other decisions to improve it. This made Tanaka switch development teams, and he ended up being the producer to the action RPG, Seiken Densetsu 2, the sequel to the Game Boy game that was called Final Fantasy Adventure Everywhere Else, where Koichi Ishii conceived the idea in 1990. It would also be the first breakthrough work for a newer and younger game designer that worked on the game's debugging by the name of Tetsuya Nomura, whose involvement with the series onwards would have a significant impact that would change the series either for better or worse by fans and critics. The overall team consisted of 14 people in total, and the development took roughly 1 year to make. Before the game's release, Square released a commercial to hype up the game in their own region that has become one of the most simplistic, well-received, and very popular commercials that would be brought to the attention of the whole world many years later. Since the development of the 4th entry was not that much longer than Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy IV was completed in roughly a year's time, and finally released on the Super Famicom in Japan on July 19, 1991. Final Fantasy IV takes place in a world called Earth that would be renamed as the Blue Planet. The Blue Planet consists of 2 separate realms where the surface is the overworld ruled by the humans, and below the surface is called the underground ruled by the dwarves. An artificial moon orbits around the Blue Planet where its inhabitants, the Lunarians, reside. The Lunarians are a race of extraterrestrials that once lived on a planet that was destroyed and ended up becoming the solar system's asteroid belt, and the race is easily recognized for having a crescent-like marking on their forehead. These beings created the artificial moon to orbit over the Blue Planet so that their kind can coexist with the Blue Planet's people one day. A secondary natural moon also orbits the Blue Planet, but its importance is not commonplace in this game. Final Fantasy IV is the first entry to break out of having 4 playable party members in favor of 5 to command a bigger team than before. The game is the first in the series to incorporate 12 playable characters based on the capabilities of the Super Famicom this time around. Thus, storytelling and adding in numerous other additions such as more playable characters gave Sakaguchi motivation for many different possibilities for the franchise going forward. The protagonist of the game is 18-year-old Cecil Harvey, a dark knight from the Kingdom of Baron, and he aligns himself with his childhood friend and dragoon, Kane Highwind, white mage and love interest Rosa Farrell, a summoner and human prodigy Rydia, a wise sage and master of magic Tella, a young bard and Damscien's king, Edward Chris von Weir, proud soldier and expert martial artist, Yongfeng Leiden, twins who are each an apprentice of black and white magic, Palom and Porum, Baron's engineer and Cecil's father figure, Sid Polendina, cocky ninja and Eblon's prince, Edward Edge Geraldine, and a Lunarian of the artificial moon and powerful sage, Fu Soya. For the first time, these characters would have their own jobs and unique abilities different from each other, so the job change system was less commonplace, as the game focused more on having set characters with their own jobs and depth in their personas. Cecil ends up being the most radical in those with the job and character growth, as he later transforms from a Dark Knight into a Holy Paladin in order to combat the darkness in and out of himself. This game would mark the beginning of taking the norm of the first 3 games into a whole new direction that was outside of the main theme of having warriors of light and darkness. Final Fantasy IV starts off with Cecil being the leader of the Red Wings that proved to be a strong air force for Baron's military, and the kingdom becomes very interested in seeking the light crystals on the surface. Upon arriving back after a successful mission in Mysidia, Cecil begins questioning the king's motives as to why they must seek these holy relics, but his questioning of the king demotes him from being the captain of the Red Wings to a lowly noble amongst the knights. His first mission ends up being a delivery mission to give a bomb ring to the village of Mist, which is a town of summoners. Cecil and Kane's arrival ignites the bombs to come out and destroy the village, which forces the Dark Knight and the Dragoon to abandon their kingdom to fight the true source of evil. However, a young girl becomes enraged with hatred after learning that her mother was killed by those two when they slew the Mist Dragon from a nearby cave. Thus, she summons the Eidolon Titan to cause massive earthquakes, which leaves Cecil separated from Kane and his pathway back to Baron, as he must travel through the desert toward the oasis town of Kaipo. He tries to amend his mistakes for the girl after defeating Baron's military from their desire to take the girl prisoner. Upon seeing the truthfulness in his personality, the summoner named Rydia agrees for him to watch over her. Before leaving Kaipo, Cecil comes to learn that a female white mage who is from Baron has traveled to the oasis town and worries for Cecil's safety after the earthquake in Mist, and it turns out that Rosa was the one who came to search for him, but ended up being stricken with desert fever that cannot be cured unless the light of the desert is obtained from the Antlion's lair near the castle of Damcyan. Cecil and Rydia travel through a desert cave where they temporarily join with the wise sage named Tella to reach Damcyan by defeating the Octomammoth to ensure easy passage to the kingdom, and Tella is replaced by Edward when his love interest and the sage's daughter named Anna is killed from the Red Wings attacking the castle that is under the leadership of a new commander named Golbez. Tella becomes bitter with revenge when learning of his daughter's murder, and disbands the party for some time. Edward joins Cecil in Rydia's cause as he must do what he can to protect the other nations from having their crystals stolen, but their first mission to find the light of the desert became first priority as the Antlion is engulfed with insanity because of the rampant increase of violent monsters roaming around the planet. The team arrives back in Kaipo to heal Rosa, and they set foot for the kingdom of Fabul to protect the Wind Crystal from ending up in Baron's hands. Upon their travels, they meet a resident of Fabul by the name of Yang, and they work together to ensure the crystal's safety. Cecil, Yang, and Edward stay and protect the crystal, and they put up a strong stand. However, Kane appears out of nowhere and questionably strikes down his childhood friend with no reason whatsoever. Rosa arrives in the crystal room to try and stop Kane, who becomes immobilized and hesitant due to Rosa's presence, but maintains his stance when the arrival of a warlock came into view, Golbez. The demented warrior strikes down Yang and Edward, takes Rosa prisoner, and has Kane secure the Wind Crystal while leaving Rydia to herself. The mission became a failure, as the only option left is to sail toward Baron and take back the crystal and Rosa combined. Suddenly, their travels toward Baron is cut short when the ship is attacked by the Leviathan that devours Rydia and separates the entire party. Cecil manages to survive, but he finds himself on the shores of Mysidia, where the Crystal of Water was taken away by him at the beginning. He tries to reconcile his misguided judgment toward the town and its elder, but it wouldn't come off that easily, as the only way to prove his innocence and truthfulness is to travel to Mount Ordeals and transfer the Dark Knight into a Holy Paladin. Cecil is accompanied by the twins Palom and Porum, where each of them are apprentices of black and white magic, and Cecil reunites with Tella when the sage is out trying to learn his forgotten magic that he left aside when abandoning his ways as a sage. At Mount Ordeals, Cecil and his team are ambushed by one of Golbez's top generals from the 4 Archfiends of Elements, but triumph toward the mountain's peak otherwise. Cecil succeeds in battling his dark self to become one in the art of a paladin. At the same time, Tello learns his forgotten spells and the ultimate black magic called Meteor. Using the spell would come at a very high price for the sage, as summoning it would take away the old man's life. Throughout the rest of the journey, Cecil manages to reunite with his older allies while fighting against the other elemental archfiends, as well as joining with newer ones, travel through the underworld to protect the crystals of darkness, travel to the moon to where he learns about his origins, his father, and the truth about Golbez and the true conspirator behind the scenes named Zemus, and battles him in a final showdown to save everyone on the blue planet from the rogue Lunarians' tyranny. In the end, Cecil and Rosa are married and inaugurated as Baron's newest king and queen. Kane leaves to train himself harder than to be easily manipulated again, and everyone else enjoys the rest of their lives with training, rebuilding, or learning what they can possibly do to better shape their future. The gameplay for Final Fantasy IV maintained the basics as the other entries, as its formula was easy and very sophisticated that shouldn't be broken. Players could take control of Cecil and his allies as they could travel to towns, dungeons, labyrinths, and the works as the other games. Probably the most noticeable feature in the game was the change in the battle system, as Final Fantasy IV was the first game of its kind to introduce the active time battle system that was different from past entries, as the player is tempted to give their party members an order in real time. This made the aspect of addressing everyone's action through turn-based battle sequences become obsolete, as battles were more in favor of selecting the actions for the characters through the continuing battles. A gauge for the revamped ATB system wasn't commonplace in this game before the upcoming sequels, but that variable became more in place in the recent remakes and re-releases that were soon to follow. In the wake of the battles that took place within the game, the need for everlasting grinding was more fleshed out as the game became more evenly paced at certain points to how strong a character needed to be in order to go through a dungeon to fighting a boss. It wasn't like in Final Fantasy 1 through 3 where the need of grinding became a top priority, even though grinding is still essential. Another new addition to the series that began in Final Fantasy IV was the introduction of save points, as the struggle between traveling through dungeons to get back out onto the world map to save a player's progress was lessened to a great extent. Save points could take place almost anywhere at certain points whenever anyone came across them in dungeons, while they could save anywhere on the world map. That way, whenever a player's party dies in battle or want to stop and return from where they left off, they didn't always have to start from the world map before a dungeon, as they would pretty much start off from a dungeon, town, or the world map altogether. The last and main feature of the game is the airship system that was brought back from Final Fantasy 1 through 3, with new mechanics added to them not done in the previous outings. Final Fantasy IV has 3 separate realms that anyone can travel upon, where they are the Upper World, Underworld, and the Moon. The Upper World was more of the main HUD, while the Underworld and Moon had selected towns and dungeons that gamers could come across, as they weren't that much diverse than the overworld map on the Blue Planet. The Underworld had the dwarves as its inhabitants, so there was a bigger emphasis that focused on a few safe places and more dungeons to travel through, while the Moon wasn't even a safe place at all, as conflict is usually an occurrence. While Final Fantasy III had the floating continent above the ground in that game's world, Final Fantasy IV made it to where travel between the realms became more accessible and selectable when that privilege came into effect. With the upgrade to the Enterprise, it can pick up the hovercraft that was given to Cecil by Edward when they first met in Dam Cyan. With the Falcon, it can be upgraded to have a drill that will grant them access out of the underworld and back onto the overworld. One upgrade that both ships could gain is the ability to travel above lava with mithril attached to their main frames to resist the intense heat. On the Lunar Whale, an interior to the ship is in place for Cecil and his party to sleep and pause to restore strength, talk to the Fat Chocobo to deposit and withdraw items like the main party could in Final Fantasy III, travel with the ship's main controls, or speak to the ship's crystal to undergo passage between the Blue Planet and the artificial moon. This gave more of a sense of non-linearity to choose where the player would want to go when it came to the side quests and such. Once again, Nobuo Uematsu was in charge of composing the game's original soundtrack, but he took into account on how to cue different musical themes based on the certain areas within the game that ranged from scripted sequences through story and battle. It was to be a huge breakthrough from the music made on the Famicom, because there was literally one piece of music per map with no emphasis on emotion to carry on the story, as Final Fantasy IV achieved that based on the Super Famicom's capabilities. At the time, Uematsu stated that the production of the game's original soundtrack was an arduous task because of the transition between the old and newer hardware that Nintendo has put out. The soundtrack has 44 pieces of music that surpassed the amount of tunes from all the Famicom entries combined, and each of them had a distinctive theme to reflect more of the moon and atmosphere surrounding certain events, such as Cecil and Rosa's affection from the song Theme of Love, to the heroic and determined journey of Cecil through the song, The Red Wings. The game's soundtrack became very memorable amongst fans and critics that Final Fantasy IV's music was the first of its kind to be included through a body of works in a piano collections album that became a staple for future entries prior to follow, and a new album of the game's soundtrack with Celtic tones to the music was brought in through CD by the name of Final Fantasy IV, Celtic Moon, which was composed by Irish musician Maya Breitnock. Breitnock's performance is more widely known for her fiddle playing, and she later collaborated with Yasunori Mitsuda in producing the Celtic-based soundtrack version of Xenogears called Xenogears Kraid. North America only had the first Final Fantasy to look up to when it came to its Western release that another game had to come from Square in some shape or form. That came true as Final Fantasy IV was the second game to come to the West, but something happened to its localization that became unknown until more light was shed sometime later. Final Fantasy IV was portrayed as being one of the most difficult entries in the series as much as the Famicom titles during their releases, and since North America only had the first game on the NES and with the two other Famicom titles failed to make a Western localization, Final Fantasy IV was renamed to Final Fantasy II to reflect upon its name continuity amongst the Western market. The localization for the Western crowd had to be one of the most unanimous undertakings by Square, as the task was left to Takashi Tokita during this time, and he described the task as being extremely difficult as it was hard to keep in contact with the Japanese and North American branches because of the absence of the internet. For example, the development team copied everything on a disc to bring overseas, but Tokita forgot to bring it with him to where the data disc had to be sent to the North American offices at a later day. As stated before, North America only had the first game to play while Japan had all three Famicom titles in their country, so knowing that there were certain experimental elements found in the Famicom entries that North American gamers may find to be extremely hard and challenging to get themselves into, Tokita aimed to make the North American release much easier than the Japanese original. This process made it more like a direct follow-up to the first game as to why Square decided to name the fourth entry as Final Fantasy II, to ease the balance between the NES and SNES game, as well as keeping the younger gamers in mind for them to try out Final Fantasy for the first time. Before the game's localization, two translations done by fans were made, with one of them being a closer resemblance to the original script, but with numerous pop culture references such as William Shatner in Penthouse magazines and several off-color lines uttered by Edge. This version was known as the J2E translation patch that was unofficial, with it not being subject to copyright law. Another version was called Easy Type, as it was meant to reduce the difficulty of the original with numerous tweaks to make the game more accessible to lighter gamers around. Folks came under the impression that Final Fantasy IV's North American localization was loosely based on the Easy Type translation that was released exclusively in Japan, but Square debunked the impression, stating that the translation was done earlier in advance, to where the difficulty was reduced much further than what was there in Easy Type. In other words, this led to the speculation that it was the other way around, that Easy Type was based on the North American localization than vice versa. Upon the North American localization, numerous elements and occurrences in the game had to be changed or omitted to abide by Nintendo's guidelines of not having any references of death or religious themes mentioned in the game, as they were already present otherwise. Some of the religious references that were changed was the renaming of the white magic spell called Holy and calling it White, as well as the Tower of Prayers in Mysidia being called the Tower of Wishes. One scene in the Tower of Zot where Rosa was about to be executed by a huge metal ball was replaced because the original had it set to where she would have been executed by a huge scythe instead. Certain abilities and spells from the original game had to be removed in the North American release, such as Cecil's Darkness ability, although his doppelganger in the fight could still use it, Palom's Bluff and Porum's Cry abilities, Young's Focus Embrace abilities, Rose's Prey ability, Edward's Salve ability, Tella's Recall ability, and Fusoya's Regen ability. These omissions were probably made to accommodate to the limitations of the Super Nintendo cartridge because of how much space it takes to translate a game from its original text and imagery it portrays. Several other changes, such as the increases in weapon and armor stats, boss stats having a dramatic decrease in difficulty, and some items that were found or usable in the Japanese original that didn't make sense to use in the North American version. Despite these changes, there were certain elements within the translation that have proven to be very receptive and very popular to fit the game really well, such as Tell's infamous quote of calling Edward a spoony bard when coming to Dam Cyan in its destroyed state. The phrase became so popular within the fanbase that its influence was used in other Final Fantasy games and within the mainstream pop culture within games such as Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Trials and Tribulations, the video game music group named by the same catchphrase, and notable internet video game and movie reviewer celebrity Noah Antweiler under his alias called the Spoony One. Final Fantasy IV released in July 1991 in Japan for the Super Famicom as well as September of the same year for North America as one of the Super Nintendo's launch titles, and the game has received many positive reviews from gamers and critics alike. Most people go as far to say that Final Fantasy IV is one of the greatest RPGs of all time that pioneered the now common console RPG features, including the concept of dramatic storytelling to where many claim the game has a very complexing and involving plot not seen from the other games. Some of the elements such as the playable characters sticking together through thick and thin and having their own complexities that made them stand out from the rest of the group became very compelling drivers within the plot, even with Kain betraying his party at certain points. Others believe that the game's story is very comparable to a fantasy novel such as The Lord of the Rings and The Man in the Iron Mask because each of their own characters speaking clearly for themselves. Its gameplay, graphics, and sound would receive high marks as much as the story itself, and many RPG and Final Fantasy fans place this entry as one of their most favorite entries that Sakaguchi ever conceived. Many publications such as Nintendo Power have placed Final Fantasy IV amongst many ranked polls from magazines and websites combined for some of the best RPGs or games ever placed on a Nintendo platform. Despite its positive praise and high reception, fans and critics tend to look back at this entry's localization as being very weak and poorly translated when compared to the previous installment. Nevertheless, it stands as one of Square's best entries that they have ever created. To this day, Final Fantasy IV on the Super Famicom sold just as much as its predecessor by selling over 1.4 million copies in Japan. North American numbers for Final Fantasy II are not even disclosed, as it seemed that the series still couldn't see a strong track record in the US. However, the subsequent re-releases helped Final Fantasy IV gain even stronger popularity from a global standpoint. Like the other Final Fantasy games before this one, Final Fantasy IV was also subjected to numerous re-releases on several other platforms, and it was re-released with updated ports and enhanced remakes at least 6 times. The first to come was on the PlayStation, and it was the first time where Europe receives the title under the Final Fantasy Chronicles compilation, which contains 2 games in one package that consisted of this game and the critically acclaimed Chrono Trigger. Plus, it would be known to North America by its true title when it re-released in 2001 under the guise of a new translation to fix up the poor translation from the SNES original. It shifted its difficulty upwards, as it was nearly on par to how difficult the original Super Famicom version was, as it was meant to show Final Fantasy fans the true experience to how it was meant to be and how difficult it was to be portrayed. This version also included a few FMV scenes as bonus content, the ability to run through towns and dungeons, and a memo save to make temporary saves in between save points. The next re-release came on the WonderSwan Color in Japan with updated graphics to place in detail and color shading, but at the cost of smaller screen resolution and downsampled sounds to fit the handheld's limitations. There was a revamp in the difficulty that differentiated from the original and easy-type versions of the game. In 2005, a Game Boy Advance port of the WonderSwan Color version was released with numerous changes such as having character portraits and text boxes, the ability to switch party members before the final battle, increased difficulty, and newer items and weapons along with newer bosses. However, numerous bugs were found in the game for it being a direct port from the WonderSwan Color, such as minor lag in boss fights and characters having 2 turns during their ATB sequences. A fixed version of this game was re-released in Japan with Europe receiving this version afterwards. Probably the most significant of the re-releases comes on the Nintendo DS, in the form of Final Fantasy IV DS, as it is the only re-release that treats itself as an enhanced remake to where everything is portrayed from a 3D perspective. Plus, it would be the only classic entry from the 2D games that ever received voice acting in a remake, and big-name actors such as Yuri Lowenthal, Karen Strassman, Liam O'Brien, and Michael McConaughey voicing Cecil, Rosa, Kain, and Fusoya respectively. The character models were more up to date as to what they would look like based on Yoshitaka Amano's designs. The game's difficulty was cranked up to the max, making this version the most difficult of the bunch, where grinding is painstakingly required. Probably what made the DS remake so significant from the others is the inclusion of story elements from the 75% that was scrapped in the original version, along with newer ones to flesh out more story development. An iOS and Android port of the Nintendo DS versions are available for the mobile platforms in Steam, and the original SNES version has been made available through the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console for newer gamers to experience and for older gamers to relive once more. Out of all the re-releases, many debate on which is the complete and definitive version of the game, as some point out that Final Fantasy IV DS is the one in the seat as the prime candidate of that category. "17 years have passed for Final Fantasy IV as it stands the test of time as one of the entries that has one of the greatest stories ever told. Since the DS reigned as possibly the definitive version of story and gameplay, Takashi Tokita and his team at Square Enix wanted to follow up on Final Fantasy IV by adding in what they considered to be a companion piece for those who crave more for the game's lore. The project was started up in 2006 when the sequel was proposed by the developers pursuing the Final Fantasy IV remake on the DS, and the idea was to create a companion piece for the mobile platforms. Rather than making a full packaged version of this game that would take at least 1 to 2 years to develop, Square decided to release the game in episodic chapters for players to experience the story after completing the DS game. This companion piece would become the sequel to Final Fantasy IV and would release on Japanese mobile platforms under the title Final Fantasy IV: The After Years. The After Years takes place about 17 years after the original game, and peace seems to run all over the blue planet until a mysterious figure disturbs its balance when it goes after the crystals. Everyone in the game has grown much older, with Cecil and Rosa having a child at the age of 15 named Seador, a young knight entering his coming of age with the Red Wings fleet, who is struggling with the expectations and obligations of being born with sacred and royal blood. Certain occurrences all around the planet are caused by a mysterious figure that looks strikingly like Rydia, but with teal hair instead of green, and the story divides up into 12 episodes, with one acting as a prologue, 8 being targeted towards specific characters including Seador, and the last 3 acting as a segue into the final confrontation against the mysterious figure named Maenad and her master called the Creator. Each character following the character's growth is what Tokita has compared the time gap between the original game and the sequel to the gap between the original Star Wars trilogy and the prequel trilogy. Rather than developing the characters with physical tradition like the original, Tokita wanted the characters in the After Years to start off as weak and make them grow more emotionally, with Cecil not appearing at the beginning, but rallying everyone through emotion. Tokita also went on to claim that creating the story for the After Years was a very daunting task, as making a game isn't about surprising everyone from behind the scenes like it was back then, but with the internet being more mainstream has made things more difficult to make something extremely compelling that would garner mass appreciation by fans and critics alike. The gameplay followed very similarly to the original game in its re-releases, but newer mechanics were added in to reflect towards the game's story and innovation that wouldn't make the game become another carbon copy of Final Fantasy IV. These newer features would be the moon phase system that would have an impact on the strength and defense when it came to weapons, magic, and armor. For example, when a full moon occurs, then the strength of weapons would decrease while the strength of magic would increase. This would leave players trying to come up with different strategies on how to win a fight, then repeating the same strategies over and over again. Some monsters would either change or appear based on this mechanic, to what stats they would have to what rarity they appear in. The other new mechanic is the new band system, where certain characters can combine their abilities to produce more powerful ones to benefit them in tight situations and such. For example, if Cecil and Rosa band together for an attack, they can release the Holy Blade, where Rosa can cast Holy onto Cecil's sword to do a very strong attack with holy attributes to the weapon. The band system has so many variables that numerous abilities are obtained through the means of constant grinding and multiple walkthroughs of the game. Most of the music from the game remained intact, with newer ones done by Junya Nakano, who worked on the music for the DS remake. Since the game was released in Japan for the mobile platforms, Final Fantasy IV: The After Years was eventually ported on the Nintendo WiiWare platform for the game to be playable amongst the Western crowd, and with the episodic scenarios releasing later as downloadable content. Upon its release for the Western market, Final Fantasy IV: The After Years was well received amongst the press. The general consensus was that the story is an engrossing, mysterious tale, and it is enough to insatiate fans of Final Fantasy IV for more of its narrative. Even the gameplay and presentation would receive positive praise, while critics claimed that the graphics remain dated, but are part of the charm with what made JRPGs so great. Even though it had a generally positive reception, the game received criticism from GameSpot, who found that the game's narrative was disjointed and poorly constructed because of the optional scenarios that were inbound, and another complaint came off with recycling content from the original game into its companion piece. Plus, they even go as far to say that the encounter rate against enemies is ridiculously high and way too excessive. Sales were met with great expectations for both the East and West, that it became a success in both critical and commercial status combined. Since some people were not fond of paying for extra content within the game, their wish for the full experience would come in about 2 years' time. In 2011, an enhanced 2D remake of Final Fantasy IV, its sequel, and an all-new game acting as a midquel between the original and the after years would come into place. These three would release as one game through a compilation called Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection on the PSP, one of its latest re-releases. The game featured high-resolution 2D sprites that were very similar to the graphical engines based on the Final Fantasy I and II remakes on the same platform, as well as the option to play through newer music or the SNES original soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu. With all three games in one, where the after years along with all the optional scenarios being available and ready to play has made Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection receive positive reviews upon its arrival. Most critics would go on to say that the original still remains as a masterpiece, while its sequel stories are pale imitations. Fans' reception comes off as being more positive toward the after years, with every scenario being available to play in the full package. An enhanced remake of the after years came onto Steam that uses the same in-game engine as the Final Fantasy IV 3D remake, but no full voice acting was fully present like before. As of now, fans are still debating on whether the 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV, the 3D remake of the after years, or Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection is the definitive collection of games to own. Final Fantasy IV is still regarded as one of the best entries of all time. Having been re-released on several different platforms and in all regions from around the world after the SNES Super Famicom original released, it has become one of Square's most profitable entries to date. It stayed true to the tradition of having an engaging storyline, memorable characters, an incredible soundtrack, and an astounding world that players always crave to come back and replay it day in and day out. Despite Final Fantasy IV standing the test of time as one of the most superior entries in the series, people often claim that the original game remains outdated due to the times and with the updates from the re-releases and remakes that were to follow. The localization of the original SNES version is also looked upon by gamers as being way too easy for the Western crowd, and that the challenge wasn't even present whatsoever. People still felt very accustomed to the challenge of the original game on the NES that it made them feel that Final Fantasy II on the SNES was a step back in its overall challenge. However, with the subsequent re-releases that followed, the game has better reception amongst the fans for bringing in that challenge that was not present at the beginning. Even though the Super Famicom SNES original remains outdated in the eyes of fans and critics, Final Fantasy IV's foundations of strong story and character development would be carried on to bigger and better games within the series, as Sakaguchi proved that his writing within the series can meet the expectations to give gamers a compelling and enjoyable experience. As Final Fantasy IV tells a tale about an individual's struggle between light and darkness, it remains another benchmark for Sakaguchi's track record for the series, and it proves that the series can work on Nintendo's 16-bit platform. Final Fantasy IV turned out to be a poster child for JRPGs on 16-bit consoles when it released in 1991, and it paved the way for other franchises to jump in and get all the fame. Some people may argue that the game spawned the bringing of the golden age of JRPGs by Square. However, as riveting and spectacular as Final Fantasy IV was, it was bound to be overshadowed by more subsequent entries in due time. But one sequel came about that almost led the franchise in a downward spiral in terms of quality and innovation. After Final Fantasy IV wrapped up, production for the next game began underway with Hironobu Sakaguchi returning as the game's director for one last time, as well as being the scenario writer, Nobuo Uematsu putting in his talents as the game's composer of the soundtrack, Yoshitaka Amano returning for the character designs and title logo illustration, Hiroyuki Ito who came in to work on this game's job system and as a battle planner alongside Akihiko Matsui, Tetsuya Nomura who contributed to the battle graphics as well as the monster and boss designs, and a newcomer by the name of Yoshinori Kitase who attributed in co-writing the scenario text with Sakaguchi, as well as working on the event scenes. For this installment, Square employed a team of 45 people to create the game, and this Super Famicom entry would require 16 megabytes of space to accommodate to the sprites, animations, and detailed backgrounds. Before the coming of this game's release, and according to GamePro in the May 1993 issue of their magazine of the same name, they learned that Japanese authorities requested to Square to not release this entry on a school day because it would mean that the kids would skip class that day just to play it. As funny as that may seem, but it would make so much sense because of the series' mass appeal in its home country. Upon its release and before a particular installment to come in years' time, Sakaguchi mentions that this entry was originally his most favorite he has ever worked on, and that is saying a lot considering the time and effort he puts into each installment to make them big and rewarding. Nearly 18 months after the previous game's release, Final Fantasy V arrived in Japan on December 6, 1992. Final Fantasy V is the first game in the series where its setting is revolved around two worlds, but the backstory behind their creation is probably one of the most intriguing ever told in a game. In a millennium's past before the events of the main story, a powerful mage by the name of Inuo has imperiled the game's world using the power of an evil entity known as the Void. The people retaliated and resisted against the mage by vanquishing him with 12 legendary weapons, but the Void itself could not be easily destroyed. Consequently, the people decide to split the power of the 4 crystals into 2 different sets, which brought about the creation of 2 worlds, and the Void was sealed in an interdimensional rift between the two. 1,000 years have passed since the cataclysm took place, and both worlds with their own crystals of earth, water, fire, and wind have prospered to flourish them with newer towns, dungeons, castles, and travel between sea acted as an evolution to the commerce of imports and communication between nations. While the first world continues its prosper of peace, a sinister and malicious force was beginning to brew within the second world. Ever since the Void incident, dreadful and monstrous demons have been sealed inside of a tree in the Great Forest of Moor. The corrupted amalgamations within the forest began to come together and emerged as a dastardly being known as Exdeath, the game's main antagonist. While this malicious tree turned into Warlock attempted to conquer it and bring the second world to its knees, a group of heroes calling themselves the 4 Warriors of Dawn fought back and sealed Exdeath in the first world using its own crystals, and peace reigned for another 30 years. That is all backstory and how the setting is initiated. Instead of having numerous characters with their own jobs and with depth surrounding them at the same time, Sakaguchi wanted to go back to basics once more by having the game star a group of 4 people that become the Warriors of Light to fight off against the encompassing tyranny surrounding the whole world. Even though the Warriors of Dawn are a new group introduced into this game, the 4 heroes for this game's tale are still referred to as the Warriors of Light. Final Fantasy V stars 5 characters in the game, with the lead being a young male wanderer by the name of Bartz Klauser, who embarks the task of saving both worlds and with him learning of his lineage in due time. Other supporting characters are Lena Charlotte Tycoon, who goes searching for her father that goes missing since his investigation of the disturbance at the Wind Crystal Shrine. Goluf Baldessian is a mysterious old man who goes by the name of Goluf Do at first, but learns about who he is while being succumbed to amnesia based on events unknown until much later. Farah Sherwiz is a pirate king who originally is suspected to be a male, but learned that he is actually a female in disguise who turns out to be Lena's long-lost sister. And Krill Baldessian is Goluf's own granddaughter who ends up taking her grandfather's place near the game's climax. Other subsequent characters would come into show, such as Sid Previa and his grandson named Mid, Guido, who is a turtle sage, and one of Exdeath's own minions named Gilgamesh, who would go on and appear in numerous entries afterwards, and his character is inspired by the Sumerian king of the same name from the poem called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The character is good and evil in both respects, and his likeliness in other games changes his persona depending on his involvement. Final Fantasy V has a huge cast of characters with their own concept art and design, and Yoshitaka Amano goes on to claim that this game's concept art is the most he has ever done by far. The story starts off when the first world's crystals start to lose their shine, with the Wind Crystal nearly dying more out of the others. King Alexander Tycoon travels to its shrine to see what is wrong, only for certain circumstances to occur which leads his daughter Lena to go out and find him. Elsewhere, the wanderer named Bartz and his chocobo companion named Boko are constantly traveling around the world when they notice that a strange meteor has crashed into a forest with goblins. Bartz and Boko go check it out, only to find a helpless girl being dragged by the goblins, and the boy ends up saving her. She introduces herself as Lena from the kingdom of Tycoon, and the two notice an old man who is nearby and unconscious. He wakes up only to be suffering amnesia, and the only thing he can remember is his name is Goluf. Bartz and Boko go their separate ways from Lena and Goluf, as they both travel to a pirate's cove only to be caught amongst an earthquake from a valley path with numerous monsters attacking them along their way. However, Bartz and Boko end up saving their lives, and he agrees to join Lena and Goluf on their journey. By arriving at the Pirate's Cove, its captain named Ferris takes the adventurers captive, and in short time agrees to join the three on their voyage to the Wind Shrine. By arriving at the shrine and in front of the altar of the now destroyed Wind Crystal, the four warriors see an image of King Tycoon and tells them that whoever sees the message must gather the crystals and protect them from this foreboding evil that is threatening their own world. The Shattered Wind Crystal recognizes the four as the ones who must protect their world, and embeds the power of wind to Bartz, water to Lena, earth to Goluf, and fire to Ferris. Taking on this burden puts our heroes at work as they travel to various locales to secure the crystals, and they eventually learn that these crystals keep Exdeath in check. If they were all destroyed, that would mean that both he and the dark essence of his evil would reign between the two worlds, but it would make them both uninhabitable overall. Along the way, they notice King Tycoon would appear and he would always be attacking Lena and her friends upon approaching them. They eventually meet up with Sid and Mid, who helps them try to secure the Earth Crystal after failing to secure the Water and Fire Crystals combined. Even putting up a valiant effort to save it from destruction, Bartz and his friends fail to keep it untouched, and Exdeath is freed and defeats the party only to retreat back to his home world. Another meteorite comes to the first world that holds Goluf's own granddaughter Krill, and her appearance helps him remember everything. Goluf tells the others not to fight as the battle is his alone, but Bartz and the others insist that his fight is as much as theirs, and everyone takes priority to travel to the second world. Upon arrival, it becomes a destructive battleground as Exdeath is wreaking havoc everywhere to search for the second world's own crystals. For the rest of the journey, occurrences take place where Bartz and his friends end up in trouble with Goluf coming to save them, such as fighting Gilgamesh to learning of Exdeath's origins. By arriving at the Guardian Tree within the Great Forest of Moor, Exdeath traps the crew with Blazing Inferno and ends up holding Krill hostage. Goluf takes it into his bones to put a stop at the Warlock without it escaping to the brink of death, but Exdeath flees after fatally wounding Goluf with his magic. Despite the party's best efforts to save him, Goluf passes his abilities to Krill as the Earth Crystal's new bearer and passes away. The motivation leads Bartz, Lena, Ferris, and Krill to search Exdeath at his tower, and they defeat him for good. However, the crystals of the second world shatter, only to make both it and the other world to be fully reunited into one. Some time has passed to where our heroes believe that Exdeath is truly gone, but he is fully revived by a thorn from Krill's palm and bears full command of the Void. Exdeath begins his rampage with destroying villages and kingdoms, only to be torn up into the Void from reality. Bartz and his crew seek out Exdeath through the path of ancient sites based on the worlds with their reunification. With the help of fallen allies, they succeed in helping Bartz and his friends against Exdeath, who undergoes a new transformation called Neo-Exdeath. They succeed and seal the Void once more with the crystal shards, and restore peace to the reunified world and its crystals. Final Fantasy V retains much of the basic gameplay from past installments, but it had its share of newest additions and changes that weren't present from before. Gamers could control Bartz and his party members with whatever one they feel should take the lead, and they could traverse them through towns, dungeons, castles, and even take rides on airships and a dragon. Side questing even came back for extra filler so that the players can look for different items, weapons, armor, and abilities to help them succeed more upon the story's completion. Since Final Fantasy IV originated the active time battle system where commands are given to the player in real time, there was no way to know when they would be allowed to attack. Final Fantasy V improves upon this feature to be the first of its kind to include a gauge to determine when a character could execute a command. This made things easier as it could give gamers the advantage of what tactics they could come up with when it came to the battles. While most of the fundamentals were in place, some of the things that were new or changed in Final Fantasy V from Final Fantasy I and III was the revamp of the job system. While most of its basic principles remained intact, newer ideas were implemented, such as having an experience gauge called ability points to level up jobs for newer abilities, and having the ability to customize commands based on the mastering of numerous jobs. For instance, if players have a character who is a knight and have mastered the Black Mage job, that character could have Black Magic added as an extra command as well. This gave many newer variables to the job system that the new ability for command customization is enough to enthrall players in giving their characters the necessary abilities for the different points within the game's tale. A total of 22 jobs are present, much like Final Fantasy III, but 3 of the original jobs were omitted and placed with newer ones instead. Those newer jobs are a Blue Mage, Time Mage, and a Mime. The Blue Mage can learn abilities from enemies and use them for the party or against their enemies. The Time Mage can cast magic that could help benefit or deter the speed of characters and enemies in battle, and Mimes are created to mimic the attacks and abilities of allies to turn against their foes. Even though those new jobs are introduced, several other jobs that were reused received various updates that weren't present from the past installments. Final Fantasy V was also the first game of its kind to include the jack-of-all-trades job known as the freelancer job, and it predates that feature in the Final Fantasy III DS remake. The design aspect became very similar to the engine used in Final Fantasy IV, but the game made more use of the Super Famicom's Mode 7 technology to give the game a 3D feeling to when the 2D planes shift when experiencing the meteors falling to the travels on an airship. The music that Nobuo Uematsu produced stated that Final Fantasy V was much more grand, that 100 different pieces would need to be created, but was eventually cut down to 56 in due time. The game had two memorable tunes to go by, and they are Dear Friends and Battle at the Big Bridge. Just like Final Fantasy II and III, Final Fantasy V did not make a Super Nintendo release from outside of Japan. Ironically, translation for the English release began after the completion of Final Fantasy V in Japan, and it would have been named Final Fantasy III in North America. Due to problems within the translation process, the project fell through. According to Ted Woolsey, who was working on the translation for Final Fantasy V at the time, he had a 1994 interview where he stated that the translation fell through because Final Fantasy V was just not accessible enough to the average gamer. Even though the project fell through, rumors started to spread that the localization was picked up 3 more times before they all met the same fate. The second attempt was to name the game Final Fantasy Extreme, but eventually was cancelled. The third attempt was to release the game for Windows computer platforms, where it would be released from Top Dog Software, but its fate was already met like the last 2 times. The fourth and final attempt was set to be released for Windows computer platforms in 1998 under the publishing of IDOS Interactive, although it was unclear whether if it was based on the Top Dog Software version or an actual fourth attempt. The many rumored cancelled attempts started to leave North American fans very angry that they ended up making a fan translation themselves, as it came to be known as RPGE for the ROM image of the game. The fan translation was well received, and it was the only English version of the game before it officially released in 1999 for the North American market. Despite Final Fantasy V being available to the Japanese market upon its release, the game started to come in as being very mixed based on import reviews. As much as Final Fantasy games held the theme of having warriors of light saving the world from dark times, critics and fans felt that the story came off being very weak when compared to its predecessor. Others felt that the game became repetitive in the enemy encounters because the rate was maddeningly high that could turn off average gamers. As critics and fans gave strong praise to the improvements on the visuals over Final Fantasy IV, they felt that the game's color scheme was washed out as it only damaged the presentation as a whole. They even go as far to say that the music is a mixed bag, and it could possibly be Nobuo Uematsu's weakest he has composed in the franchise. The consensus was that even though the game had some memorable tunes, most of the other tracks were not as compelling to entice players based on the moods and situations in the game's story, as they felt that the game's soundtrack was average at best. Negativity wasn't the only thing that the game had going for it, but the game had some very high marks as well. The gameplay became a big mark as its main highlight was the extended freedom of the job system to where players could potentially master every single job while given the option to fully customize their commands in battle. The menu system and field navigation received great attention for them being more sophisticated and more improved over the previous game. Final Fantasy V would release in Japan with the game selling nearly 2.5 million copies. North America seemed to be in a real pickle without seeing Final Fantasy V make a Western release. That was completely averted as a compilation game set was going to be released for the US market to where gamers could play the game for the very first time in the form of Final Fantasy Anthology. It also included another game in its library that would be the sequel that is yet to come. For the North American release in 1999, the game is fully translated for a PlayStation 1 release, while many believe that its translation was resumed from where Ted Woolsey had left off before canceling it back then. However, translation issues occurred, where character names were changed from the Japanese version as Bartz was originally called Butts in Japan, and Lena being called Reina instead. Even some dialogue changes were in place, such as Ferris having a pirate accent that wasn't present in the original. Upon its release in Japan in 1998 and the US in 1999, the PlayStation version of the game received mixed reception much like the original. Most of the criticisms from the original game were still intact, with newer ones being aimed at the poor translation, the load times that took place between battles and menu screens, and the portrayal of Ferris having a pirate accent to which angered fans. The only good thing about the game that critics pointed out is that Final Fantasy V was the only reason to own the compilation. Europe received the PlayStation version of the game in 2002 that was based on the North American release. Final Fantasy V would receive another re-release, and it wouldn't be until 2006 when it would come out on the Game Boy Advance, where it would be published by Nintendo in the US and Europe, and it would be known as Final Fantasy V Advance. The GBA version of the game went through an overhaul in terms of the translation, and numerous additions were in place, such as 4 new jobs added in the job system that would be a Gladiator, Cannoneer, Necromancer, and Oracle, a new dungeon called the Sealed Temple, and a new optional boss fight against the antagonist of the backstory named Inuo, who was created by Tetsuya Nomura, the monster designer of the original. Other features such as a bestiary, quick save function, music player, and additional equipment not found from the Super Famicom original. Unlike the original game and the PlayStation re-release with their mixed receptions upon their release, Final Fantasy V Advance received very positive reviews from both critics and fans. Many of them strongly praised the game's newer translation as it falls more closely to the Japanese original than the PlayStation 1 game, and the newer features can only engage the interest for those to keep playing. While the characters are considered unlikable and the plot being predictable or trite from back then, many agree that it has a stronger narrative when compared to the JRPGs of today's standards. Final Fantasy V Advance is considered the definitive version for all territories because of Nintendo helping Square improving upon the criticisms that were originally had on the Super Famicom and the PlayStation. The PlayStation version of the game would go on to sell at least 340,000 copies in North America, while the GBA version sold more than 250,000 copies worldwide. Most Final Fantasy games as of today tend to receive a sequel, prequel, or a companion piece that goes along to expand more continuity within each game's universe. Would anyone believe longtime fans if they were to say that Final Fantasy V was the first to do that in original video animation form? Believe it or not, Final Fantasy V had a sequel in the form of an OVA that spanned itself into 4 episodes under the name Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals, where it was animated through Madhouse Studios. The story is a direct sequel as it takes place 200 years after Bartz and his friends defeated Exdeath and sealed the Void altogether. The story revolves around 4 new characters who end up becoming the new Warriors of Dawn. The main protagonists are a headstrong and reckless boy named Pretz, and a brave young girl named Lenali who is a direct descendant of Bartz and a novice at summoning. The other members are Valkus, a loyal and strong airship captain of the Tycoon Air Force, and a beautiful sky pirate named Rouge, who could possibly be influenced and derived from Ferris's character because of her being a sea pirate in the original game. A new threat comes from the Dark Moon in the sky as it plans to seek the crystals for the main antagonist, Ra Devil, so that the Void can be opened to magician the appearance of a new god named Death Gunos. The OVA was released in Japan in 1994 and received a North American localization in 1998 with English voice acting. Upon its release, Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals received mixed reviews from critics and fans. Even though it would be the first sequel to a main entry in the Final Fantasy lore, its addition did not become very favorable to the Final Fantasy legacy, as the animation was nothing special, and the over-reliance of comedy above dramatic storytelling made the OVA a cruel mockery to the brand because of its lighthearted tones and excessive usage of fan service. While there were some positives to the OVA series, many believe that Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals was a failed attempt to tell Final Fantasy through film, as it was a lackluster and bland retelling of Final Fantasy V. As of now, the OVA is released on VHS in both Japan and the US, as it is becoming a very rare collectible to have, while Japan has seen it make a release on DVD, whereas the license for the North American market has expired to where a DVD release seems very unlikely to happen. Final Fantasy V would be the last game in the series to be directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, as his time with working on other projects took more priority than sticking with only one franchise in particular. As of right now, Final Fantasy V is made available through the Wii Virtual Console in Japan, as well as the PlayStation Network for newcomers and older fans both. Some may come under the impression that this game remains as probably one of the most overlooked entries when compared to prior installments, as it could be the weakest in Sakaguchi's work in the 16-bit generation. Final Fantasy 1, 3, and 4 each improved the formula of gameplay and storytelling with every newer game, where some felt that Final Fantasy V only came as a small step up on improving the overall formula in comparison. This was partially due to Final Fantasy IV improving the storytelling aspect from past installments that made every character have their own story to make them become very likable, while Bartz and his friends came off being more generic and lackluster. The theme of Warriors of Light was already starting to run thin as the concept was reused a third time without it hardly bringing anything new into the mix. When compared to the other games Square released today, this entry still remains as one of the better entries, in which some may say that still holds up thanks to the improvements that made the game very definitive on the Game Boy Advance, to where it gives people another chance to reflect upon the game's final product. Final Fantasy V is one out of two of the 2D games in the series that has not received a fully enhanced remake to be a part of what the older games could look like with newer generations of hardware. Final Fantasy 3 and 4 are only released on the DS, and a DS remake was possible based on an interview with the series' current producer named Shinji Hashimoto, but the project is currently undecided for the platform due to technical issues. However, the project may see the light of day on the Nintendo 3DS, due to the system's better capabilities that could get past the technical difficulties that the DS had, whatever they could have been. This raises some hope for fans, as it is one of the few remakes of the more recent Final Fantasy games that they want to see be updated for today's standards. Before Christmas 2012, a recent rumor popped up by Square Enix, with them stating that Final Fantasy V may be bound to be remade for the Apple iOS, but being remade with higher resolution 2D graphics or 3D visuals has not been finalized until now, with them favoring more of a higher res 2D game. It is available on the Apple iPhone, with it being re-released on the PC through Steam. Final Fantasy V may be viewed as the black sheep of the 16-bit outings amongst some people, but everyone, including Sakaguchi and Square, agreed that it was time to move on with surpassing the conventions of past installments into newer ones, or the franchise would have an ugly and obscure future waiting for it. Next time on RRPG's Final Fantasy Retrospective, we take a look at the last Final Fantasy game on the Super Famicom that not only challenges the conventions from past games, but pushes beyond the expectations to where it has become the biggest 2D game, as well as longtime fans' most favorite entry in the series.